Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our class on the life of David. We are in lesson 6 today as we look at David the Fugitive. We're looking at 1 Samuel 23 and 24. 1 Samuel 23 opens up with David and his men, and they're on the run from King Saul. David has done nothing wrong to merit Saul's attacks, Saul's pursuit. And so David, the innocent, continues to run and flee for his life. The reason he's on the run is because Saul is just so convinced in his mind that David is out to try and steal the throne from him. He's jealous of David. He's afraid of David. David seems to be everything that Saul cannot be. He's a great leader. Success seems to follow him wherever he is. The Lord certainly seems to be with David more than ever with Saul. And so Saul is, in his rage and his jealousy, is pursuing David. Well, 1 Samuel 23 opens. David's on the run. With him is his family, and with him is a group of around 400 men. You find that described in chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. Well, David, in 1 Samuel 23, the chapter opens, and David hears about the Philistines, and they're attacking and raiding and plundering Keilah. And instead of letting just Saul take care of it, the king, his responsibility, David takes it personally. He personally inquires of the Lord to see if he can offer his strength and his help to deliver God's people, to deliver Keilah. And so he inquires of the Lord. Well, the men hear about this and they're not so sure. Because remember, at this time, they are exiles. They are fugitives. They're on the run. And so David inquires twice of the Lord to ask. And twice the Lord tells them that they would defeat the Philistines. And so they go in verse 5. David and his men went to Keilah and they fought with the Philistines. And they led away their livestock and struck them with a great slaughter. And thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. Well, they did a great thing. And that shows us the heart of David, who's willing even to put his own life on the line to help those who are in need. That's a great leader. That's a shepherd at heart, willing to help any sheep that's in danger. Well, you look at verse 8. Saul found out that David was in Keilah. He found out where he was. And so Saul sees this as a golden opportunity to go and finally capture and kill David. And so in verse 8 it says that Saul summoned all the people of war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. This isn't just a small feud. It's not just between David and Saul. Saul is gathering all the people of war, all the soldiers. I mean, this is an all-out war between David and Saul. So one interesting detail before we kind of go on from here with our story is that in verse 6, it says that it came about when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand, or an ephod. The ephod was part of the garment that was worn by the priests. And it's depicted as something similar to an apron or a kilt. It was worn over the robe, and the breastplate was attached to it. I remember back in the book of Exodus, chapter 28, and describing the garments of the priest. Well, it suggested that this was no ordinary ephod, but this was the actual ephod of the high priest, which bore the breastplate of the Urim and the Thummim. Look back at Numbers 27 and verse 21 to read about those. And so this is the only ephod which had the power to inquire of the Lord. And so David has in his company a priest and an ephod, the means of inquiring of the Lord. And so wherever it is that he wanders in the midst of this fleeing, in the midst of this hiding and running, he has with him a priest and the ephod. He can call on the name of the Lord and inquire the Lord's favor wherever he goes. It's an immense blessing that David has, an immense tool and benefit that David has in his possession now. Well, David, knowing that Saul was plotting evil against him, inquires of the Lord. And he asks for two things. He asks, one, is Saul coming to destroy the city on his account? In verse 10. Is he going to come and destroy Keilah on David's account? And then number 2, when the men find out about it, when the inhabitants, the people of Keilah find out about it, will they turn David over into Saul's hand? And the answer to both is yes. That Saul coming will spare no one. He'll tear down the city and kill everyone if it means getting David. He showed that last chapter and what he did to Ahimelech. But it also shows us something about the men of Keilah. so concerned with their own life, even though David just delivered them, even though David just saved them, they are willing to abandon him, to completely turn their back on him, and to hand him over to Saul if it meant saving their own lives. So David is forced to flee again, and he flees into the wilderness of Ziph. And though initially, verse 13, Saul kind of gives up pursuit, he really hadn't given up the hunt. Because you see in verse 15, David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life while David was in the wilderness of Ziph. He hadn't really given up. Maybe the initial pursuit of going to Keilah, Saul abandoned. But you think of the phrase found in verse 14. Oh, it's a painful phrase. Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. There's the pain and then the justice. There's the bad news and the good news. Saul didn't give up. Every day he's considering, where is David? Can we find him? Can we capture him? But the grace of that is God did not deliver David into Saul's hands. God kept David safe. Well, so here's what happens. It's in this time that Jonathan finds David and makes this incredible statement in verse 17. It says, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul, my father, will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you, and Saul, my father, knows that also." David will be king, and I'll be your right-hand man. Wouldn't that be great? If only. Well, Saul is told where David is, and they pursue David, and they come to the mountain of Maon. And Saul almost seizes them. It seems like Saul just about gets David, but at that time, in the nick of time, the Philistines start raiding the land, and Saul is forced, as king, to retreat and to go and to fight the real enemy, the Philistines, who are plundering Israel. And that it, Saul is willing to pour all of his time and his resources and his armies to go after David, who has done nothing but good for Israel, rather than defending and protecting and defeating the real enemies, which are the Philistines, which are raiding Israel all across their lands. Well, so that's how 23 takes place. Chapter 24 opens, and Saul is being told that David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. En-Gedi, there were these cliffs on the western bank of the Dead Sea, and Saul and his 3,000 men elite force head that way to try and find David. Well, it just so happens that Saul, in the heat of the day, sought a cool cave, the inside of that cave, to just kind of get away for a few moments, to relieve himself and to rest. Well, caves in that region, not unlike caves we see here. Once you go in a few feet, you can't see anything. I mean, you can't see any. It is pitch black. You could have your hand in front of your face and you can't see anything. And so Saul goes into this pitch black cave, and he goes in there to just cool down and to relieve himself. The amazing thing, though, is that in that very same cave, David's in there. David and his men are in the inner recesses of that same cave. And the thing is, if you're in a cave going in from the outside, you can't see anything. It's all dark. But if you're inside the cave looking out, you can see who's coming in because you're looking at the light rather than looking at darkness. And so David can see who's coming in. David could see, and with Saul's stature and the clothes he would have worn, maybe the regal robe that he has on, there would have been no question as to who it is who's coming into this cave. Well, before we look at this dilemma, because can you only imagine what are the odds that of all the caves in the region in En-Gedi, of all the caves that existed on the western side of the Dead Sea, what are the odds that Saul would end up in the same cave as David, the exact same cave? Now, before the story plays out and we finish up the rest of it, one thing we can look at here, one thing we can notice is what's going on in David's heart. Because in David's heart, there are two psalms that express what David is thinking and feeling at this time. One is Psalm 142 and one is Psalm 57. In both of these psalms, David expresses his loneliness, his pain over his oppressors, and yet in both psalms, he describes God as his refuge and his strength and his deliverer, his shelter. In Psalm 57, in the midst of his suffering, he focuses on God and he gives God the praise. I'm going to keep my marker here in 1 Samuel 24. Just look over with me at Psalm 57. Just notice some of the language here. Psalm 57, notice what David says here. In his heart, focus on praising God, even in the midst of such troublesome and difficult times. It says Psalm 57 verse 5, it says, be exalted above the heavens, O God, let your glory be above all the earth. Down in verse 7, my heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing, yes, I will sing praises. I awake my glory, awake harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. For your loving kindness is great to the heavens, and your truth to the clouds. Be exalted above the heavens, O God. Let your glory be above the earth. Can you imagine? This is what's taking place in David's heart. While all this is happening, while on the run from King Saul, or hiding from King Saul, and then, more specifically, right here, this is when he's hiding from Saul in a cave. What's on his heart? It's not, woe is me. It's not, where are you, God? It's, be exalted, be magnified, glory to God. I mean, David is just so in tune with God in this season of his life. He's thinking about God. He's calling out to God. He's remaining focused on God. This is just so important to remember that in the times of your life, the times that seem so hard, so difficult, when it seems like oppressor after oppressor or oppression after oppression continues to come, to evermore buckle down and to focus your mind on God. The thing is, because David's heart was so in tune, was so focused on God, he is able to overcome the incredible temptation he faces here back in our chapter, in chapter 24. Because here's the scene. David and his men are hiding in the cave. Saul comes in, and it seems, depending on how you look at it, it seems like God is giving Saul into David's hands. He's giving the enemy right into his hands. At least that's what David's men thought. Because in chapter 24 and verse 4, the men of David said to him, behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I'm about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. His men said, this is it. This is the time. Look at it. What are the odds? Here is Saul. He's resting. He's asleep. God has given him into your hand, David. Take his life. I mean, think about it. Think about it from that standpoint. Think about if you had been one of David's men. You and or your family have been journeying with David nonstop, always looking over your shoulder, never able to stay in the same place long, never really able to sleep, constantly afraid that you're going to get caught. And you're not just running from one man or a group of people. This is Saul using the armies, the fortified, strong armies of Israel, all the men of war, to capture David. And so he has to be careful. He has to be calculated in his thinking about where he's going to go and where he's going to hide. And it's not just David he's looking out for. All the men who are with him and all the people who have aligned themselves with him and their families if they're with him. They're journeying together, trying to keep themselves safe. Well, think of it. This is your chance to end all of it. Because if you kill Saul's life, if you take his life, it ends. Saul is the reason for all this. Saul is the reason we're on the run. Saul is the reason we're hiding. You take his life and life goes back to normal. No more hiding. No more running. No more escaping at the edge of a sword. Life goes back to normal. Can you imagine how nice that would have been? Can you imagine how tempting that must have been for David? Well, herein lies the subtle temptation. Ready? One word. Revenge. It's all about revenge. Revenge is getting even. Revenge is settling the score. Revenge is treating others the way that we have been treated. It's a temptation that presents itself in several ways for us today. Maybe not hiding in caves and taking someone's life, and maybe it's an employer, a boss, who promises but never delivers. Promises a raise, but you never get that raise. Promises a promotion, and you never get that promotion. Or a spouse who just seems inconsiderate. They're never putting your needs before their own. You seem like you're always working, always serving, always helping, always putting their needs first, and yet they never seem to do the same for you. And you ask, and you let them know that there's some things that they could do that would be really helpful for you, and they always seem so inconsiderate. Or a parent who has failed you, or a coach who didn't play you, or a friend who betrays your confidence. And it's in those moments we have to choose. How will I respond to the hurt I receive from someone else? Because as David's men here seem to reason, I have a chance now to even the score. I have a chance to right some wrongs. And that's how some people view it. Some people think about revenge as, well, justice must prevail. Justice must be done. Justice is so important, we have to uphold justice. And we are entitled to make things right. Or we might say things like, well, I'm just doing what they did to me. They did it first. I'm just doing what they did. I'm just saying what he said to me. I'm just showing them what it's like to be treated this way. Or what he did was worse. What she did was worse. He deserves it. She deserves it. If you saw what she did to us or to someone else, you would know that she deserves all of this. And yet we have wisdom, guidance from heaven. God's word that says in Proverbs 20, verse 22, do not seek revenge. Or Romans 12, verse 17, never pay back evil for evil to anyone. It's not our place to make things right. It's not our place to uphold justice. Not true justice, not this kind of justice. Paul would end Romans 12 by saying that we don't overcome evil with evil. We overcome evil with good. And treating others the way that they have treated us is not what is right or what is just or what is fair. David had everything he needed right here to seek revenge on King Saul. He had the opportunity. He had the excuse. He had the support of his men in the cave who were claiming this came from God. And yet, David did not kill Saul. David did not take Saul's life. He does, however, in verse 4, cut off the edge of Saul's robe. Just the edge. And afterwards, even just taking a piece of Saul's robe, just a piece of it, always conscience bothered him so greatly. Because here's that heart, that tender, compassionate heart, the heart after God's, a heart so sensitive even to the slightest excuse, the slightest measure of retaliation. He's so sensitive that even just cutting off a piece of the robe breaks that heart. Obviously, David was sensitive in ways that others were not. Because what's the big deal? I mean, it's just a coat. It's just a robe. He probably has dozens of them. It's just a piece of the robe. But this goes back to our excuses, doesn't it? Sometimes we tend to excuse similar situations, saying things like, well, it's just a message on Facebook. It's just a Facebook message. It's just some words. Or I'm just treating them this way because of what they did to me. Why did David not retaliate? His reason is listed for us in verse 6. When you read in verse 6, it says, far be it from me, because of the Lord, that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. The reason is, despite that Saul was a flawed and very evil man, David respected the position that he was in, and he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. So here's the real point. This is what this is all about. Had David been wronged? Yes. Was Saul in the wrong? Yes. Was it David's job to make it right? No. That's what he understood. Saul is God's anointed king. And he knew that if it's going to be made right, it's not going to be on David's timetable. It's not going to be in the way that David deems right or necessary. God anointed him. He is God's king. And God will handle it in his time. What's interesting is that in verse 7, it says that David persuaded his men with these words and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose and left the cave and went on his way. The word persuaded means to tear apart. This was a heated exchange of words between David and his men. David persuading his men against taking revenge on Saul. Do you remember that passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33? Bad company corrupts good morals. Well, the opposite of that is true as well. That one good person, one godly person, one person who holds their convictions can make such an immense difference in the lives of others. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, guys, I don't think we should do this. I don't think we should take this course of action. I don't think we should be watching this kind of movie. I don't think we should be listening to this kind of music. I don't think we should be treating this person this way. It takes one person of immense character and faith that can really change the hearts of others around them, especially when a person is like David. Men listened to David. The people respected David. He was a man consistent in his faith and in his devotion, in his walk before God. People saw it and they trusted in him. And so when David argued with his own men, you're not going to take Saul's life, even though they had a heated exchange, must have been really quiet in the cave because of Saul's there. Don't do it, don't do it. They listened. Well, what follows then is that Saul leaves the cave. Saul exits. But David's not done. David's not done with Saul. David confronts Saul, verses 8 to 15 here of our context of 1 Samuel 24. And we're reminded here that David's confronting of the king reminds us that when you've been wronged by someone, you have every right to declare the truth. You think of Matthew 18 verse 15, that if anyone sins against you, show your brother his faults, that you may win your brother. It's not about defeating someone in their sin, about defeating them and winning an argument. It's about winning a brother back or winning a sister back. They're in the wrong, and you want to help them get back to the right. And so David brings up this accusation against Saul. He confronts him. And David's charge, it's obvious in verse 9. David says to Saul, why are you listening to the words of men, saying, behold, David seeks to harm you? He says, Saul, you've been listening to the wrong people. Your mind is clouded by listening to the wrong voices. Boy, don't we have a lot of that today? Depends what outlet, but the media is going to sell you a certain line, a certain rhetoric. You got to be careful who you listen to. Be careful where you draw your facts, your information from. He says, you've been listening to the wrong voices. Let me clear the air. People have been saying, I'm trying to kill you. Let me tell you from my own mouth the truth. And so I want you to notice what David does here to make his charge against Saul effective. Number one is that he remains respectful to Saul. Verse 8, he calls him Lord and King. He says, my Lord, the King. And Saul looked behind him, and David bowed his face to the ground and prostrated himself. And so he didn't speak demeaning to Saul. He didn't shout at him. He didn't call him names. No, he behaved with respect towards Saul. He continued to demonstrate kindness and compassion and respect in his accusation. Our tone and our attitude are just as important as the words that we speak. Then in verse 10 and 11, the second thing he does is that David provides proof. He pulls out the cut robe, the piece that he had cut out, and he showed that he had the opportunity to kill Saul, but he didn't. It was a clear and substantial evidence. Your men are saying, I want to take your life. Why don't you look right here? I had every opportunity just now to kill you. Look at your robe. Do you see that piece that's missing? Got it right here. I had a chance to kill you, and I didn't. What's that tell you about my intent? What's that tell you about my heart? What's that tell you about the truth? And then in verse 15, and perhaps the most important thing that David did here is that he left the judgment to the Lord. In verse 15, he says, the Lord therefore be judge and decide between you and me, and he may see and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. So let the Lord be the one who judges between the two of us, between me and you. Who is right? Who is wrong? It's not for you and I to decide, Saul. God's going to decide. And in between the lines, you better make sure you're right before the Lord. It's more important to be right in his eyes than in mine. Well, Saul is pricked to the heart. He's touched. And in a moment, he seems to see it. Because you look in verse 20 of our chapter here, it says, behold, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established into your hand. It's an amazing statement from Saul. He's been doing everything he can to keep David from being king. They get to take David's life to preserve his own family line on the throne. And so he says, I now know that you are going to be king. Realize when Saul said this, from verse 2 of our context, his 3,000 men heard this too, or at least many of those men heard it too. I now know that you will be king. It's interesting, isn't it? Well, he makes David promise in verse 22 not to cut off his descendants, as was typically done when someone new comes onto the throne. They just, when a new dynasty begins, the old one is just put to death, put aside. Let's just remove everyone from the old dynasty. David swore to Saul he would do so. That was never in David's heart to kill all of Saul's family. Saul is thinking about life as a king of the earth, like a king of the nations around him. But he's not thinking that David has a different kind of heart. He also, in verse 26, 1 and 2, Saul returns home. The chapter ends and Saul returns home. He goes back home. But David does not go back with him. David doesn't return back with him because even though Saul repented, even though Saul for a moment seemed to change, David was not going to be naive. He knew it was not going to last. Because it says in chapter 26, in verse 1 and 2, the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is David not hiding on the hill of Hakaliah, which is before Jeshimon? So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having with him 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search for David in the wilderness of Ziph. David's not naive. Oh, Saul is saying all these words here, and he seems so changed, but it's very likely just because he got caught. He got caught, and David stood on the truth, and it was embarrassing for Saul. He was completely humiliated because he had nothing, no evidence for what he was doing. David removed all the false belief, the false rumors through his evidence here. And so Saul seemed to change to the things he said, but David knew that was not going to be the case. Well, I'll tell you this as we end. This chapter reminds us of a tough lesson, and that is life's not always fair. Now, there's going to be times when we have Sauls in our lives, those who misunderstand us or misrepresent us, those who undermine us, those who fill our days with adversity. The question is, how do you handle Saul-like adversaries in your life? When you got someone like Saul in your life who seems to continue to pursue to make your life hard, how do you handle those kind of people in your life? Well, number one, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when it happens. Don't be surprised when there are people who treat you a certain way because of the convictions you have, because of your faith in Christ, because of your walk. Don't be surprised when people treat you a certain way because of your association with Jesus. In fact, in the book of Philippians chapter 1, Paul makes a statement with that very language of do not be surprised. Don't be surprised about the kind of conduct you might receive. He says in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 27, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. Look, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. So don't be surprised. The time will come. Secondly, don't operate on their level. David didn't. Saul has been doing everything he can to kill David, to take his life. And David didn't do that. David did not treat Saul with hate, with fear, with suspicion. Saul was his own way, was very earthly, was very sinful, was very wicked. Here's David, a man after God's own heart. When someone treats you a certain way, when they treat you like Saul, when they treat you like an enemy, don't operate on their level. And Jesus says, treat others not the way that they've treated you, but treat them how you want them to be treated. Treat others the way you want to be treated in Matthew 7, verse 12. So don't treat them the way you have been treated. Treat them how you want to be treated. Treat them with kindness. Treat them with compassion. I think of the book of 1 Peter chapter 4. Think what Peter says about how you respond to those who might treat you harshly. 1 Peter chapter 4, think what he says in verse 15 when he says, make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or a troublesome meddler, But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he's not to be ashamed, but to glorify God in this name. Don't let it be something that cripples your faith. Don't let the actions of someone who is treating you evil and harshly, don't let that be the thing that steals your voice of praise, your heart of devotion. Men may be evil, God is always good. Don't forget that. Don't forget that. Even kings in Israel, God's own nation, appointed by God, were evil and wicked. But you know who wasn't? God. God was consistently good and consistently with his people. Even there in the cave, God was with David. Peter would also say in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, he says, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lust, which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. He says, people are going to come maybe with suspicion. They're going to slander, saying certain things about us as Christians, as believers. Silence them. No, not through aggression, not through treating them like the world. No, we don't overcome evil with evil, remember. We silence their false accusations by living a consistent, godly life, by providing the proof through the way that we live. No, we're not evil. We're not vindictive. We're not belonging to some kind of a cult. No, we're living the right way, the righteous way, because Jesus really lives. And we're showing that evidence of love and grace, of pursuing the truth. We're living that out in our lives. And here's the last thing. So maybe I got to solve my life. Number one, don't be surprised. Number two, don't treat them the way that you have been treated. Okay? Stop the bad. You got to end the bad and start doing good. And then here's number three. Part of how you do, number two, part of how you don't respond in kind, take them before the throne of God in prayer. Take their name before the throne of God in prayer. Matthew 5:44. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Pray for them. Pray for your enemies. Pray for those who make your life hard. Take their name to the throne of God and leave them there. God, this person is hurting me. This person is saying things that are just cutting deep. Help me, please, to be more like you, to respond like Jesus did when he suffered. Look at 1 Peter 2 and how it ends. Help me to respond like Jesus did to his suffering. Lord, I don't know what's going on in this person's life, but please help them, change them, bring peace so that they may stop treating others, and myself included, in this way. Take their name before the throne of God. Here's the thing. At the end of the day, one thing that I'm sure David understood at this point, you can't control others in your life around you. You can't control what they do, how they think or how they speak. You can't control how they will treat you. What you can control is you. As one quote says here, if there's any blame, leave it with me. Don't you live with it. You do all you can to be at peace. Don't be the reason. Don't instigate. Don't bring about people that treat you harshly because of your bad or rude or inconsistent or just poor behavior. Don't live at peace. Do all you can to be loving and gracious and kind. But realize there's going to be people like Saul who will come up in your life. You can't change it. In many ways, you can't change them. You can try and influence, and you can try and encourage, and you can show a right example and a right response to pain. But at the end of the day, all you can really do, all you can control, is yourself. And so control your heart. Control your heart. In your suffering, don't moan and bemoan. Don't let it be a woe is me. Don't cry a martyr. Remember David. More importantly, remember Jesus, who suffered and left us an example. Even in our suffering, even in our pain, we will continue to glorify God and to honor our King. David shows us that so well here. What immense strength for a man after God's own heart, who had the moment, he had the power and the opportunity to take someone's life, to enact revenge, and he didn't. You will never demonstrate greater strength than when you have the opportunity, when you have the ability to strike, to enact revenge, to use your strength to hurt or to wound someone who has wounded you. But instead you restrict, you control, You keep your passions and your emotions submitted under the will of Christ, and you instead choose peace where others have chosen wrath. That to me is one of the hallmarks, one of the key defining features of someone who has a heart after God's. Thank you so much for studying with me today. I hope that you've gotten something out of our study here. If you've got some things that maybe you've seen from these chapters, something that stood out to you, reach out to me. Let me know what you're seeing, what you're learning. We're going to continue on with our study, going on through the life of David. And so come back and join us again as we continue our study. But I hope you have a wonderful day. Continue to walk with God, consistent, pursuing to have a heart just like his. Thanks for studying with me. Take care.